Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. And we start today with a song.
There's more to life than pleasing all the people at the top. There's more to making musicals than making agitprop. What I supply an audience is not mere mind control, no! I don't feed them propaganda, I feed the soul.
Bon appetit.
Greetings, Musical Talk listeners. It's Mike Shapiro, coming at you from sunny Southern California, where some of nature's most glorious landscapes are nestled in a protective layer of pollution. When I got wind of a soon-to-open musical based on the classic sitcom The Honeymooners, I wasted no time in tracking down composer Stephen Weiner for an interview. And sure enough, Stephen gave plenty of interesting insight about his upcoming show. However, I also got a cross-section of a career of a real veteran of the industry, someone who's received high praise from figures like Stephen Sondheim, and earned some of the most prestigious awards available to writers during the development process. We'll also hear profound and practical advice for aspiring theater creators, and tales of the pursuit of the most elusive of musical theater projects, the TV or film adaptation. Let's take a listen.
Musical Talk.
I'm here with Stephen Weiner, composer of the new musical The Honeymooners, which is an adaptation of the famous CBS sitcom. Stephen, thank you for joining me here today.
Thank you very much.
Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about yourself and some of the projects you worked on prior to Honeymooners.
Okay. Well, I have been writing music since the age of 3. The urban legend of my family is that my parents bought me a baby piano, a toy piano. I sat down and played Mary Had a Little Lamb with both hands. My mother took me to the doctor because she thought there was something wrong with me. I wrote my first musical at the age of 6, a major dramatic piece called Mr. Halfback. I was heavily influenced by my 6-year-old brother, who was a football fiend, and this was about a halfback who gets sick the day of the big game. That's all I remember of it. The reason how I got into musical theater is my dad is a physicist and a patent lawyer, and he went to night school when he was going to law school. So I really didn't see him a whole lot for the first 7 years of my life. We lived in a very small apartment in the suburbs of Philadelphia. And he would study on the weekends, and I was allowed to play with my soldiers and my forts very quietly while he was studying. We didn't have a record player. We had an old Grundig tape recorder, and he would listen to all the greats. So I cut my teeth on Lerner and Lowe, on Rodgers and Hammerstein. I think the first show I ever listened to, and I didn't, of course, understand a word, what I was listening to was My Fair Lady. And then it was Flower Drum Song. And then it was South Pacific. And all the great ones. That's how we studied. We just studied listening to this. In addition, my mother was Belgian. But being raised in a bicultural, and predominantly we're Walloon, French, the very first records I played were Edith Piaf, and all the nursery rhymes were in French, and so I was raised in this cocoon of just rich melody that came and honored the musical theater craft as well as this beautiful French music. So by the time I was in grade school, I was really immersed and kind of had an inkling and understood the craft. And because I played by ear, I never listened to what the teacher was doing because I could play everything myself. As I got older, there was a greater awareness that I got to do something with this. And by the way, by the time I was a teenager, and I was a child of the 60s, so you can just track it. I was the first kid to run out and get the Kander and Ebb album. Like, nothing excited me more. Or Julie Stein, and when Sondheim hit, I was all over Company, or Promises. I wore that album out, Bacharach. I still adore Bacharach. I was heavily influenced by the, if you will, the golden era writers of Broadway. And even though I have great appreciation for a lot of the new and upcoming writers today, that's really what I was influenced by. In college, I was breaking into the music rooms at Muhlenberg College just to play and to write. and I didn't know what to do. And it was finally when I moved to Arizona in my mid-20s, I was faced with a dilemma because I wanted to write, but I didn't know how to write my music down. I couldn't read music, so I couldn't be like a pit musician of any kind. So I went to the next best thing, and I started to act, because I always had a good voice too. And I got to a level of where I was a pretty good actor, and I was doing a lot of regional stuff in Arizona. And one day, I found out that actually the director called me, a director friend of mine in Arizona called me and said, "Hey, we're doing a new original musical. Will you try out for it?" And I said, "Well, actually, I'm committed to doing another show, but I'm going to come see this show." And it was a show called The Medicine Show. Nothing ever happened to it. And after the show, I went backstage and I met the writer. And I said, "How did you get this on?"
Meaning, how did he have it staged?
Yeah, how did you get this staged? Like, who did you talk to, right? And he said, "Well, I'm a member of something called the BMI Musical Theater Workshop." And I said, "What's that?" And he gave me the number, and I called the New York number. And I got the legendary Alan Becker, who used to run the BMI Musical Theater Workshop. And I called, really excited, and he said, "Don't you know that you can't call this number?" And I didn't know, and I apologized. And he told me about auditions, and when the auditions were, and what I was required to do. And I was supposed to write a comedy number, a charm song. What the hell's a charm song?
One of Lehman Engel's favorite terms, I believe.
And a ballad, right? And then I said, "Right, okay." And I ran to the library, to the Phoenix Library, which was probably the size of one's bathroom. And they had one book on how to write songs for the musical theater by Lehman Engel. So I was lucky. The gods were smiling on me. I read it, and I started writing my songs, and I decided I was going to be a composer-lyricist. And I came to New York, and I'm in the middle of like this waiting room, and all these people are really nervous, and Alan Becker comes out and he says, "I have good news and bad news. The good news is we're on time. The bad news is Lehman Engel died today. Okay, who's first?"
Wow.
And it was like, what? So, but I went in, and the panel that I played all of my songs for was Maury Eston, Carol Hall, Alan Menken, Carrie Gold, and maybe Ellen Fitzhugh, I'm not sure. But it was a pretty nice assemblage, and they laughed at the comedy song, and they seemed sufficiently impressed, and they said, "We'll be in touch, thank you." And I left, and I got a call like a day or two later that I got in.
Where were you living at the time?
Phoenix.
So you flew out to New York for the
So
audition.
I flew back to New York, and then I flew back to Phoenix, and I found out that I got in. And I was dating my wife, and I told her that I got in, and I just said, "I'm going back. This is it. I got to do this. Because this is the way in which I'll start getting my stuff produced." And I told her, "Please come back with me." And so we did, and we got married shortly after we came back here, and had Marla shortly after that, my first daughter. And BMI opened my eyes, and now I could understand what I was doing intuitively. In my class, I had folks like Lynn Ahrens and Steve Flaherty, Doug Cohen, No Way to Treat a Lady, immensely talented people. After a while, after many years of being in the class, and BMI has this system, and the first year your teacher is Skip Kennan, or when I was there, it's no longer the case, but Skip was the teacher, and then Richard Enquist, who's since passed away, kind and lovely man, was the teacher for the second year. And I was working on a show at the time called Goodbye, Mr. Chips, based on the classic movie and book. And I adored that. I wanted to write it so badly. And I remember the first thing Skip told me is, "Stop writing that show. Stop writing it. Think of something else." And to this day, I've always had dreams of doing it, but it's impossible to get the rights, and I think Leslie Bricker still owns the rights. And it turned out that he had written a full West End musical version of Goodbye, Mr. Chips, in addition to the movie. So maybe Skip was right.
The advice he gave you was not, this has no potential artistically. It was caution that you're working on an owned property, and those are hard to negotiate. Yeah.
So that was my first disappointment of many. And then when my lyricist didn't get in, I had to choose a new lyricist. So I asked him for the names of some people that I could start working with, and he recommended a couple people, and I did my obligatory interviews. And there was one young man at the time, very young, right out of Harvard University, by the name of Glenn Slater. Glenn and I hit it off, and we started writing music for potential property that we thought would be a cool musical, Dirty Rotten Scoundrels. This is way before the David Yazbek, right? And we wrote a song that just kind of tore the roof apart. You know, it was great. And Glenn had been a composer lyricist. I was a composer lyricist. And he didn't want to write music as much as he wanted to write lyrics. I didn't want to write lyrics as much as I wanted to write music. So it was a really nice combination. And we wrote a couple songs for Dirty Rotten, and one thing led to the other. And I had started work on my own on an Albert Brooks film called Lost in America, which was a hilarious 1980s movie. And I had gotten a lot of traction on that show at BMI, and people really liked it. And I was a composer lyricist on it. But then I said to Glenn, I said, well, why don't we kind of work together on it? And he said, okay. So we worked on Lost in America together, and we took it to the ASCAP workshop. And that Michael Kirker was running with Stephen.
Still does.
And still does. And we did 3 presentations. ASCAP has changed, their format has changed, but we did 3 presentations. And at the first presentation, actually this was before Stephen, Charles Strauss was still running it with Michael. So Charles, Michael, Manhattan Theater Club, and the Schuberts were there. And they really, really loved our work. I mean, again, it was really a terrific boost of confidence for us. And that led to Manhattan Theater Club saying, we want to commission you, Glenn and I, which was thrilling. And the Schuberts were really, really interested in Lost in America. The problem was that everyone tried to get the rights from Albert Brooks, everyone. So we had David Geffen write a letter. We had Stephen Sondheim, who wrote a beautiful letter for us, because Sondheim was, he listened to our second presentation and basically said, I have nothing to say. This is the real thing. And it was like a thrilling moment, probably one of the great moments of my life, when Stephen Sondheim said that. He wrote a beautiful letter for us. Maury Yeston wrote a letter. Charles Strauss wrote a letter for us. I mean, we had all of these, Carol Hall, I mean, all these people were writing letters, but Brooks said no way.
Was he just not enamored with the idea of a musical adaptation?
Yeah. It had nothing to do, I don't think he even listened to our material, which we sent. So it was really a disappointment, but what came out of that was a commission. And the commission was for a show. And Manhattan Theater Club had commissioned Stephen Schwartz to start writing some songs for an idea that was based on his title song. It was going to be a review about songs regarding New York City. And he had written this fabulous song called Crowded Island, which I thought was just such a fantastic name anyway for the review. And one thing led to the other, and there were a number of writers that were going to participate, and all those other writers kind of dropped off, and MTC commissioned Glenn and I to write this review. And we could not use the name Crowded Island, so we went with the most original, brilliant title, New Yorkers. Not The New Yorkers, which is the Cole Porter review from the 30s, but New Yorkers, which made it even worse because we're always confused with The New Yorkers. So we had 5 actors, and it was a 85-minute romp, talking about life in the city, and we got pretty good reviews. And I think it would have moved if it hadn't been for 9/11. So we opened in 2001, and 9/11 had just happened. So that was really disappointing, in the sense that a lot of the things that we had made fun of, you could no longer make fun of. So that was my first New York off-Broadway thing. A couple stories about New Yorkers. First of all, it was my first real experience kind of working in a highly pressured commercial environment, even though it's a not-for-profit theater. Glenn and I had written the whole show, but the last third, a couple of the songs weren't working, and it was just a series of songs. It was like 26 songs strung together. There was no real book, but the last couple songs weren't working. So we literally stayed up for 3 days and wrote the last third of the show. And one of the songs that we wrote, which was very off color, one of the actors, Pam Isaacs, was in The Life, and a gorgeous singer, and she actually won an Obie for her performance in New Yorkers. I remember when we gave her the song, she said, oh, I don't know. I can't sing this. My mother's going to be here, that kind of thing.
This is the off-color number.
Yeah. And I remember Lynn Meadow came, and she sat down, and she listened to it, and then she looked at us, and she said, fellas, you're tired. And it was cut. And we wrote something else that actually worked just as well. But it taught me the value of writing quickly and being willing to throw out your babies and doing whatever you have to do to get the show right. And that was great. And Chris was really good that way too. I mean, Chris was a very good architect for the show, and he knew what worked and what didn't, and pushed us a lot, pushed us in a very healthy direction.
And when you were done with all the revisions and throwing out of the show that you wrote in a fit of exhaustion, did you find that the through line that you were looking for manifested in the end?
Yeah. The last number of the show was a ballad I'm very proud of called Manhattan 4 a.m. And it was sung beautifully by Jerry Dixon. And it really just talks about the serenity, really, of the city and how, at night, like around 4 a.m., when everything is really pretty quiet, that's when people's dreams are starting up for the next day. And it was just a lovely way to end the show. And so I thought all the work was worth it. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that prior to New Yorkers, I also had my first commercial regional debut with a show called Spit and Image, not based on the English comedy series, but it was a show based on a very obscure book written by the poet laureate of Kentucky named Jesse Stewart. Now, this is where desperation and dreams kind of clash. At the time, I needed a new project when I was in BMI, or else I was in danger of being thrown out of the workshop, because that's what happened. You always had to continue to present or else they would kick you out. And I needed something. So I remember I ran to the public library in the city and I found this book and I thought, oh, well, this is fun. This is interesting. Well, it was about a bunch of Appalachian hillbillies in Kentucky. It's based on a true story. And they were welfare cheats, but they took great pride in being welfare cheats. And it was the story about how they kind of got by. But the narrator of the story was this little boy who was actually very, very bright and had a lot of potential. So we took that story, and I wrote this show with two wonderful writers in my town, Yardley, PA, Laura Zabel Cohen, who is a poet herself, and Karen Kasten, who is a playwright. I remember after they read it, they said, you got to be kidding me. It's like, this was so far from our experience. Like, what did we know about these people and why? I just said, oh, come on, we just got to write it because I needed something to present. And one thing led to the other, and we totally revamped the entire conceit of the show. And what Karen did, which was brilliant, by the time we got to production, we really had two stories in one. We had a modern frame. So it was this boy that had come, this kind of truant boy who was kind of a bad kid, and he was sent to kind of stay with his grandfather, who was a writer. And the grandfather throws him a book and says, hey, you got some time on your hands. why don't you read this? And as he's reading it, the story comes to life.
So this is a framing device you've added around.
It's a framing device around the actual hillbilly story. And what we did is to heighten the stakes, because in all musical theater, the stakes have to be heightened. This boy is really smart, and he secretly learns how to read. And by doing so, he actually saves the family in the end. And he decides that he wants to go to school. And of course, his grandfather is appalled. Like, why would you want to do that? And he says, hey, Grandpa, I'm not your spitting image.
Let's pause the interview for a moment so that we can take a listen to one of the songs from Spitting Image. The song is called Husband's Hand.
I remember waking on my wedding morn, sisters busy baking, brothers husking corn, daddy strangely quiet by the meadow down, weaving me a daisy crown. Uncle rubbing boot black till my old boots shone. Auntie scrubbed my church dress, starched it like a stone. Daddy set the daisies gently on my hair and blessed me with his wedding prayer. May all your days be sunny. May all your dreams be grand. May life be milk and honey. When you hold your husband's hand, Granny and my mama pulled me to the side, brushed my hair and whispered, "What night will bring the bride?" Granny told my future, right in rosy red. Mama kissed me twice and said, "May all your days be sunny. May all your dreams be grand. May life be milk and honey. When you hold your husband's hand, no matter how happy the man and wife, no matter the dream so grand, after the wedding comes real life, and nothing is what you planned. He couldn't hold on to a job, we couldn't hold on to our land. The only thing we had to hold was one another's hand.
We actually got some nice reviews again for this show, and it taught me a lot just about the basics, the basic machinery of how you get a show up, and it was pretty thrilling. It was really thrilling. We had some really nice Broadway talent, and it was the first time I really had an audience kind of clap for my work. And then New Yorkers followed that, and then after New Yorkers, Glenn and I got the rights for a movie by the Coen brothers called The Hudsucker Proxy.
And this is a fairly well-known film.
Fairly well-known film. Well, at the time, the Coen brothers gave it to us for like $2,500 just to, have the rights for like 2 years.
How did you get in touch with them to begin with?
I swear to you, I don't remember. I think we contacted their attorney, and it went very smoothly. I mean, it was just ridiculous. It was like crazy wonderful. And we wrote the show. We did a reading of it, and Jerry Zaks directed the first reading. He actually directed the 2 readings, and Michael Arden was our lead, brilliant. And we had Kevin Chamberlain, who is now in LA, who's a brilliant actor, and just a whole bunch of just wonderful, wonderful actors. And it was a real electric feeling because the show, you could tell, had legs.
Let's pause here and take a listen to one of the songs from Stephen's musicalization of the Hudsucker Proxy. The song is called I'm Your Man.
Amy, how many times do I gotta tell you? You're the best there is when it comes to the human interest stuff. But the business pages is no place for a broad. Tibbs, this one is yours.
Tibbs? Tibbs? How can you give this to Tibbs? Blundering, dundering Tibbs. He can't find a lead with a compass, a dog, and a map. You could sleep for a week after reading his prose, which he won't start to write till the bars start to close, and he only digs deep when he's picking his nose. Even then he gets nothing but crap.
All right then, Perkins.
Perkins? Perkins is merely a kid, still writing with crayon, I bet.
Hey!
And Jones wouldn't know an idea if it fell on his head.
Oh, Amy.
Shapiro and Flynn have a case of the dumbs, and McLean's still evolving opposable thumbs, and the god-awful truth is the rest of these bums couldn't find their own way out of bed. Of all of the guys you could use, it's obvious who you should choose. Tell me who got the scoop when those cons flew the coop? Who was there when the poop hit the fan? Tell me whose little write-up got phone lines to light up? That's right, bub, I'm your man. Tell me who dished the dope on that nun and the Pope when they tried to elope to Japan? Who made old Walter Winchell look strictly provincial? C'est-moi, pal, I'm your man. I'm your man. I'm your guy. There's no writer who's writer than I. What you need, I supply. Frankly, chum, you can snigger, but balls don't come any bigger. And who tore the lid off that kid from Madrid and exposed what he hid in the phlegm? Betcha no one wrapped fish in that morning's edition. It's true, pal. Thanks to who, pal? Face it, I'm your man.
Amy, what about the fashion report?
Filed it.
And your sweatshop expose?
On your desk.
Well, how about the crossword?
Finished. In ink.
Then maybe it's time you took up knitting.
Knitting.
Or something.
Something.
Come on, Archer, wake up and smell the estrogen. You may be one of the guys, but you ain't one of the guys.
But chief.
Yap, 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 here it comes again, flap, 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 with their gums again, holy smoke, what a joke with her blah, 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 blah.
Hey.
There she goes, getting pissed again, pantyhose, in a twist again, geez Louise, can it please all that blah, 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 blah.
Watch it.
It might not quite be female, but you'll never, ever be male, if that's your plan.
That's not my plan.
To be a man.
More than a man.
Don't think you can.
You bet I can. Who can do breaking news, film reviews, interviews, and the deadlines whose headlines have run? From obits to the comics to yes, economics, there's just one contender, regardless of gender. 'Cause face it, this newsroom is now you know whose room. That's right, boys. So I fight, boys. Fella, Pally, Mister, I'm your man. Nova Barnes is the bunk. I'll bet my Pulitzer on it.
Unfortunately, one thing led to the other, and the producers at the time who had optioned the show sat on that option, and we lost the rights. And so that was kind of another disappointment. This is going somewhere. It's not all bad, but I guess word to the wise, when you choose to become a musical theater writer, you have to understand that you're going to face probably more periods of adversity than those good moments. But the good moments are really great moments, you know?
It's worth noting that a lot of the projects you've described are very ambitious, and,
Yes.
and some that will happen as we continue to talk, because they're adaptations of known works
Yes.
or licensed properties.
Yes.
And these are notoriously hard opportunities to have in the first place. So
Exactly, Mike, and it's really it's a good point. I mean, and when you think about things like Dear Evan Hansen and Next to Normal, and those shows. I mean, Tom Kitt and Brian Yorkie, they did a smart thing. You write an original show. They each have their challenges, right? If it's an original show, how do you, if you don't have a quote unquote a name and you're not established, how do you get people to even come to your readings? It's getting to the point in New York where, first of all, nobody reads scripts anymore. Nobody listens or reads scripts. That's my humble opinion. And I've heard that too. Everyone just goes to readings. And then even then, if it's a name project or a name writer, they're going to come to it. But if you're not a name in musical theater, or you're not doing a name project, then you already have something more that you've got to prove, and a lot of people won't even come to those readings. So it's a little bit of a catch-22 in these days with, in terms of getting heard, which is why having festivals like NAMT and, the festival that I participated in, the new musical festival that Marcia does in LA. That's why it's so critical, because sometimes that's the only thing that you have, to get your material heard.
So the alternative is to do some well-known property, if you can get access to it. The devil's bargain being you may then run into issues with rights and decision makers.
Precisely.
And control of the property.
Precisely. So there's, like Lost in America, like Hudsucker Proxy. These are it's the grand Faustian bargains that you have to strike. Hudsucker Proxy was a musical that Glenn and I are still extremely proud of. I hope very much that one day it can get done and that we can convince the Coen brothers to give us the rights again. I don't think they would be disappointed. A number of theaters still ask us if they can do it. And we'll see what happens. But it's one of those, and I think every writer has one of those shows. For Lynn and Steve, it's Bedazzled. They wrote a brilliant show, which I had the privilege of listening to in the BMI workshop for years and years and years. And it was Bedazzled, and they, it never really got on. I mean, everyone has a show like HUD or Bedazzled or whatever. After the Hudsucker Proxy, I wrote a show which was an original musical with a wonderful lyricist and book writer who's very funny, and her name is Susan DeLallo. And we had met years and years ago in the BMI workshop. In fact, I remember one day I couldn't get a sitter. My sitter canceled last minute, and we have 3 daughters, but Marla was the only one that was around, and she was a baby. I remember it was my turn to go up and present my song, and I had the baby. And so I turned to Susan, who was sitting next to me, and I said, "Here, hold the baby." And so Susan's holding Marla. She said, "I've never held a baby before." She's holding Marla. I go up to do my song, and that's how we met. And we wrote a show based on a Prince and Pauper kind of feel. We wanted something magical and Prince and Pauper-ish without doing the Prince and Pauper. So we set our show in New Jersey, Secaucus, as they say, Secaucus, New Jersey, and it was about 2 cousins who switch places, who are they look exactly identical, and they switch places, and it was a very funny show, and it got produced first at my alma mater, at Muhlenberg College, which has a great theater program and a summer music theater, and it went really well there. After that, we won the Richard Rogers Award, and after that, Susan won the Kleban Award for the book. And then Marriott Lincolnshire Theater did it, and Village Theater in Issaquah, which is a suburb of Seattle. And for all of you listeners, I would say that Village Theater is probably one of the great unsung champions of new works in the United States right now. Rob Hunt is the artistic producer, and they are just amazing. I mean, they put their money where their mouth is. You know, they believe in new musicals, they champion, they nurture it. They have this amazing process where you're invited to do a reading, and then the audience kind of fills out cards and talks about what they liked and what they didn't like. And if they like that, they elevate you to a workshop status. And then they do a full workshop, fully staged workshop. And then from the workshop, you go to the main stage. And so it's a wonderful developmental process. And New Jersey kind of went through that process. And we had a gorgeous production there. It was an absolutely gorgeous, gorgeous production.
In terms of the scenic design?
Scenic design, talent, orchestrally, everything. It was just, it really was the full realization of what we saw our show to be. And then we had the good fortune of the Royal Scottish Academy of Music and Drama doing it, and then the Liverpool Centre for Performing Arts did it in England, which I regret to this day that I should have gone over to see it. Because how cool would that have been in Liverpool, you know, the home of the Beatles, you know, with their cool accents and stuff. But
did they regionalize it, or did they set it in the? I guess they can't really set it in the UK. If
well,
it's called,
I think they probably added their own 2 cents, because it's kind of hilarious. Because our main character is Vinny Lobianco. Vinny Lobianco, hey, right? And they called him Vincent.
How proper.
Vincent, hello, Vincent. You know, so God only knows what they did. But and it's been done in a couple high schools and community colleges. So it was very, very fulfilling. And then after that, I got a call from someone who was an intern at MTC when we were doing New Yorkers. And her name was Cara Reichel. And she and her husband, Pete Mills, and 4 or 5 other Princeton grads had formed a new theater company in the city called Prospect Theater Company. Now, Prospect is one of the most admired theater companies now in the city, and is reviewed by the New York Times, and they've done just amazing work. And they take chances on new writers as well, on a shoestring budget, and they manage to make everything look and sound extraordinary. And Cara said, hey, my husband Pete is looking to write a song for one of our things called Dark Nights. And so Pete and I wrote a song together. And Pete is a graduate of the NYU musical theater program. And I would say that he is the successor to Sondheim. Pete is funny, he's brilliant, he's facile, he's laugh-out-loud lyrics, and just an incredibly fertile mind. So the key for the Dark Nights was that it was all based on Hamlet. So they had 8 writing teams writing 8 different takes on Hamlet. So we opened the show and we wrote something called Omelette, which was very funny. And so we knew that we had similar writing sensibilities, and Cara wanted a show for that next season. And I had just recently watched a documentary which was unbelievable called East Side Story, based upon the actual Soviet attempts during the 1950s, Cold War, to write musicals. And it was truly horrendous. And you see these women on tanks, threshing and holding their rakes and singing, and people doing major choreography on the factory floors. I mean, it was real, the babushkas. It was bad.
I assume these were state-sponsored propaganda.
State-sponsored propaganda, but it was so bad it was good. So I said to Pete, what do you think? He said, this is it. This is our show. We ended up concocting a story of 2 Nebuchadnezzar writers who are always one step behind the 8 ball. They are dying to be the next big thing, but they just don't have the luck. In fact, they wrote a musical, these 2 guys, based on the year the Yankees won the pennant, which we all know was Damn Yankees, but their version was Faust Ball. And so, which is the first big laugh of the show. So we wrote Iron Curtain, and it talks about how they get kidnapped to the Soviet Union because they answered this ad, to write the next big Broadway musical. And they say, well, sure, right? And the producer is actually an agent for the KGB. They get spirited off to Soviet Russia, and now they're trying to get back, and all this malarkey ensues.
Let's pause for a moment and take a listen to a song from Iron Curtain. This tune is called Lap of Luxury, and I should clarify that it's L-A-P-O-V, indicating a proper noun.
Don't worry, we will not hurt you. And starting tonight, you will be living in the lap of luxury. Come on. Top-notch rooms,
Check.
most with doors,
Check.
bathroom facilities on some floors,
Check.
windows too, though they're pay-per-view. That's life in the lap of luxury.
First-rate bed,
Check.
Moscow's best.
Check.
Potato on the pillow for every guest.
Check.
13 thread count canvas sheets.
That's life in the lap of luxury suites.
Complimentary compliments.
Check.
Optional wake-up slap.
Check. Staff speaks Russian, English, and French.
And check.
That's life in the lap
Of luxury. Concrete walls.
Check.
Comfy stool.
Check.
Basement flooded.
No indoor pool.
Check.
Continental breakfast beats.
That's life in the lap of luxury suites.
Gentlemen, welcome to the finest hotel in all of Moscow.
Yes, gentlemen, may I help you?
These are our honored guests, Mr. Getz and Mr. Finkel. Please do everything you can to make their stay with us enjoyable.
Very good, sir. Please sign the registry. Here is potato. Now, do you have any bags?
Just under my eyes.
Yuri, I trust that everything is in order.
Yes, comrade, exactly as we discussed.
One-way glass.
Check.
Two-way bed.
Check.
In-wall camera, infrared.
Check.
A listening device in the thing that gives you ice.
You mean the ice machine?
No, the shower.
Long-range lens.
Check.
Shortwave lean.
Check.
Taps on the bathroom sink.
A line from the bureau to the Politburo.
Nothing but the finest bugs, Yuri. That's life in the lap of luxury.
And it was a very funny and very successful show. We got really nice reviews for it. And Iron Curtain came to help Pete and I later because it was based on Iron Curtain that we got hired to write The Honeymooners. And so Iron Curtain had two rounds off Broadway. It had its first production, I want to say 2006, and then we came back in 2011. In 2008, the O'Neill invited us up, the O'Neill Musical Theater Conference. If you've never been to the O'Neill, it's marvelous. The O'Neill is this gorgeous, gorgeous pastoral place in Connecticut where writing teams are invited up to do a reading of whatever they're working on. And so we got in with Iron Curtain, and it was just gorgeous and just a really nice time for us to re-explore the piece. So 2006, first production, 2008, the O'Neill. Then we did the workshop of Iron Curtain and a reading for Iron Curtain at the Village Theater again. And they both went very, very well, so they wanted to do a full production. So we had a full production at the Village Theater again in Washington of Iron Curtain, and then we did it again on Off-Broadway. It's my fervent wish that one day we can see it on Broadway because I think it has the potential for a full Broadway musical and people would enjoy it. And with everything going on politically now with Russia, I think the timing is right.
The sun never sets on Russian enmity.
That's right. That's right. After Iron Curtain, so I was looking around for my next project, and I hear about this interesting title, Rocket Science. And I thought, Rocket Science. That sounds like a very cool title. And I tried to see it when I was in Cincinnati, but it had literally come and gone. Right? It was there for like a week or two. So I couldn't find it anywhere. So I looked up, who wrote this thing. And I look up the writer of Rocket Science, and I just emailed him. And he was very gracious, and he sent me the movie script. And I said, oh, okay, so maybe there's something here. And I think I had won the Larson Award the Larson Grant, the Jonathan Larson Grant, with Glenn for Hudsucker. And I'm at the dinner, and I meet this young guy who I knew, who was a very talented lyricist. And his name was Jason Ryan. And I knew, my gut told me that I needed a smart, kind of young, hip lyricist for Rocket Science, because Rocket Science is about a high school kid who has a stutter and is trying to fit in and find his voice. So what he does is he falls in love with the speech and debate diva, this attractive yet brilliant and manipulative young girl.
And she recruits him, essentially.
She recruits him. And I just thought Jason was right for this. And so I got him to say yes. And then my agent hooked us up with a marvelous playwright, Patricia Cotter, who had written a number of musicals already and was really fantastic. And we set out to write Rocket Science.
Let's pause here and take a listen to one of the songs from Rocket Science. Now, Stephen knows that I am particularly fond of this show, and he was very patient while I essentially fan-stalked him by email for years before this interview. This song is called I Found You, and in it, the aforementioned debate team diva Jenny explains to Hal, the boy with a speech disability, why she's recruiting him for the debate club.
Do you mind if I speak frankly? Do you mind if I'm upfront about the massive, blaring, really needless complications that by choosing you to team with me exist? I'll just be honest if that's cool. Then I will take your staring blankly as a green light to be blunt about your lengthy, glaring slate of major limitations. I'd be happy to provide a total list. Were my mother not left waiting in the car?
Thanks, but no, thanks.
Just a second. There are things that I can sense in you as verging on redeeming that you can harness, that you can be. And yeah, to anybody else, well, look, you might as well be screaming, I am hopeless! But then there's me. There's a little speck in you. I've seen it. Right now it's just a glimmer, just a fleck. You're sending out distress calls, saying, help me, I'm in here. But no one came and freed you. Me, I read you loud and clear. Hey, Hal, I found you. You're gonna be okay. I found you. Help is on the way. I flew by your island. You were waving from the ground. I'm waggling my wingtips and I'm circling back around. I found you, so let yourself get found.
This is a bad idea. Classically bad. Edible bad.
You heard it first right here. You've got potential. It's there for you to bury or become. I got your student folder from my secret inside source. And is your academic record largely checkered? Well, of course. Who cares? I found you. A blip in a barrage. I found you like a Monet in my garage. You're not quite mint condition, but you're not beyond repair. Some minor restoration can fix that tiny tear. I found you, I'm keeping you, so there. heart.
How are you even possible?
And you don't speak perfectly, so that's where we'll start. I need a William Jennings Bryan. Come be my halting Henry Clay.
Just no.
Oh, see? You disagree. So we are clearly on our way. You're mine, I found you. Abandoned on a bus. I found you. There's them and then there's us. It's a great big world of no ones. But look what we can do. Together we are something. Apart, you're only you. I found you. I choose you. I'm never gonna lose you. Look, I
Musical talk.
Every show that I've worked on, and this goes without saying, but you have to fall in love all over again with the characters, with the story, with whatever you're doing. The rush of passion that takes over when I write, it's like everything else kind of goes away, and you're just kind of in this world, and you're writing. And Rocket Science was like that. It was a property where I forced myself to stretch my abilities musically and to write in a much more contemporary style than I normally would. There were no boundaries, there were no restraints. I just kind of, whatever was in my heart came out. And I didn't know what we had. And then sure enough, we won the Richard Rodgers. I won the Rodgers again, and that was thrilling. And we had a series of readings. This was one of those moments I was talking about where you have elation, right? Because here I am sitting with Stephen Sondheim, the chair of the National Arts and Humanities for a second time at the table, who had listened to Rocket and liked it. And, you feel great and you think, oh, wow, we have this sunny future ahead of us. But with a series of things that just happened, the show never materialized in terms of the next step. We've had a lot of close calls. We've had some marvelous readings. The Royal Scottish Academy did a semi-production of it, which was really nice. Andrew Panton did a gorgeous production of it. And we've had some really great readings. But we never really got to off-Broadway, where I always thought this belonged. And hopefully one day maybe we can. Maybe we'll get the rights back. But it's a show that I would say is still in progress.
Now, I'll pause here to point out to our listeners that Stephen is being very modest, and he has casually alluded to some of the most prestigious awards that can be earned in developing new musical theater in the United States. The Richard Rodgers Awards, which is adjudicated by Stephen Sondheim,
Yep.
of which you've won 2.
Yes.
Not one, but 2. The Jonathan Larson Grant, also a very prestigious and difficult to land award, being accepted into the
Eugene O'Neill.
Eugene O'Neill, sorry.
Yeah.
Eugene O'Neill Development Workshop. Also, these are essentially top tier opportunities for developing writers.
Thank you.
And Stephen's being very modest in mentioning them and not wallowing them too much. So just to contextualize the story for our listeners, we're listening to someone who, despite not having formal training at the beginning of his career, really achieved a lot of major milestones that you could hope for as a developing writer.
Thank you.
So that's my embarrass the guest framing device.
All right,
so.
Thank you. So after Rocket Science, which we did really try to push uphill, we got a call from these executive producers out in LA, Bill Nuss and Dusty Kaye, who themselves had pretty impressive credentials. Bill was the original writer and showrunner and producer of 21 Jump Street. He discovered Johnny Depp. He's written a number of shows, NCIS, and Dusty Kaye was the executive producer and writer for Entourage, for Roseanne and a couple other major iconic series. And they had always been ardent Honeymooners fans. And so they wanted to write a musical based on the Honeymooners. And because, Bill works for CBS and Honeymooners was a CBS series, they were able to get the rights. So this was the first time in my career where I didn't have to fight for the rights or pay for the rights, which was wonderful. And Bill and Dusty had gotten some recommendations from Lee Johnson. And by the way, here's a note to listeners. Sometimes you don't think your career's moving, and sometimes you don't think these things kind of, there's like a circle of life to them, but there really is, because Lee Johnson, who used to run the musical theater program at Manhattan Theater Club, who listened to Glenn and I that night at Lost America, he's the one that's recommending Pete and I to Bill and Dusty, because Bill and Dusty were looking for people that could capture that golden era sound. And Iron Curtain captures that golden era sound. They listened to our work, they liked it, they thought that we could do it, and they offered us the opportunity of a lifetime. And when they approached us to write The Honeymooners, and I will say this, even though I'm a child of the 60s, The Honeymooners was before my time. I mean, I knew The Honeymooners. I mean, I grew up watching Jackie Gleason on the variety shows, and I knew Art Carney and all that, but I had never truly watched The Honeymooners. So I knew that this was big. This was an iconic title. So Bill said, well, let me send you the Classic 39. I said, what's the Classic 39? He said, The Honeymooners that you and I know was 39 episodes.
Over about 2 years, right?
2 years. And Jackie Gleason said, like 1956, 57, we're going out on top. We're going out on top. And Art Carney actually wanted to stop as well, because he was afraid he was getting pigeonholed into Ed Norton. So I watched all Classic 39, and Bill and Dusty had a script, and they had a lot of ideas for song placements and things like that. And we started this long distance writing relationship. So the good news is that after 7 years, 5 readings, I want to say, and a change of directors, and we are happily in the hands of John Rando, who is a genius. He won a Tony for Urinetown. He directed On the Town, the major hit from last year, and his partner in crime, Josh Bergasse, who choreographed On the Town, and Gigi and Charlie and the Chocolate Factory this season. Josh is our choreographer. So we're just blessed with these incredible artists. And, we've gone through our series of different people trying out different roles, but the folks that we have going into our production now at the Paper Mill Playhouse after all these years, and that's how long it takes. That's how long it takes.
7 years.
7 years, I don't know. Most, look, there's always kind of that rare thing where, you write it and it goes right to Broadway. And maybe that happens to people that are more established.
It's so annoying when that happens.
The truth of the matter is, there are a lot of ups and downs. We had some good readings. We didn't have some good readings. We had theaters announced, and then we pulled from those theaters because we weren't sure if they were the right venue for us. And so here we are. And so our leads, we have a cast of 23, and our leads are Michael McGraw, who's been with the show now since the beginning. And Michael won a Tony Award for Nice Work If You Could Get It. He just finished a brilliant run in The Government Inspector. What makes him brilliant in the show is, and this is kind of like Nathan Lane and The Producers. When you watch Nathan Lane, you were watching Nathan Lane. You didn't feel like you were watching Nathan Lane do Zero Mostel. So the ability to create the character and the spirit of the of the character, the original character of that Jackie Gleason character. So Michael really brings that to life. We have a wonderful, wonderful, brilliant, funny actor that's going to be taking the role of Norton, Michael Mastro, that has done a ton of Broadway television and movies.
I think it's worth pausing at this juncture to explain to our listeners, many of whom are in the UK,
Right.
a little bit about the source material, about what the Honeymooners was
Right.
and its influence in American television, and why this lends itself so well to musical theater.
So the Honeymooners is really about a bus driver and his buddy, who's a sewer worker, that live in Brooklyn, and it's the story of this guy that thinks of one scheme after the other to try to get his wife and him a better life. And even though he has a caustic tongue and he's a tough guy, right? He loves his wife and she loves him, but she's the only one that can really stand up to him and kind of, not take his nonsense. And his buddy in crime is always kind of helping him. And so the bus driver is Ralph Cramden, the sewer worker is Ed Norton, and Ralph's wife is Alice, and Ed Norton, the sewer worker, his wife is Trixie. And the four of them kind of, they're neighbors. They live on top of each other, and they were the first ever sitcom in American television. And every sitcom that has followed their formula.
There are also a couple of long-lasting tropes in American cinema that all come directly from the Honeymooners. Right. To pick one really obvious example, the show The Flintstones, the cartoon, really was a transformation of the Honeymooners formula.
That's right.
The two couples, there's a headstrong guy who's not too sophisticated, and he's got his friend who's sort of an enabler, a little more mellow, but he's going along with the schemes. And there's kind of good-natured domestic bickering between them.
Right.
That's the Flintstones, but that all came from the Honeymooners.
Right. And there's some classic things, To the Moon, To the Moon Alice. And so there's a lot of classic stuff. And what Bill and Dusty have done brilliantly, and the book is phenomenal and funny, a lot of laughs. They've decided that in this version, Ralph and Ed, through a series of circumstances, they applied for a jingle contest and they win. And so now they're hired by Madison Avenue to become jingle writers.
So you've got a fish out of water story.
Right. So these two guys that really, just Madison Avenue and these guys don't compute, right? The sophisticated world of advertising, the cutthroat corporate world don't compute. And what happens and what ensues is really the basis for our musical. And we've had a wonderful time writing it. And the person that I'm writing it with, Pete Mills, who we wrote Iron Curtain with, you're in a good place when you laugh a lot. And we laughed a lot when we wrote this show. We laughed a lot, and trust me, there are a lot of songs that we threw out, and there were some, and that's the beauty of doing readings. Just like you did your wonderful show now, Mike. You figure out this is what works, this is what doesn't. You toss that, you try a new song. That's the nature of it. Yeah, that's the process. And so we are at a point now where the Paper Mill Playhouse, which is a marvelous regional Tony Award-winning playhouse in Millburn, New Jersey, which has sent a number of shows now to Broadway, starting with Newsies. What else? A Bronx Tale, which is Glenn's show and Alan's show. They've sent, what else? Bandstand they sent. And Jason Robert Brown's show, Honeymoon in Vegas, another honeymoon title, that went. So they've sent a number of shows. And so Paper Mill they just do incredible, like Broadway productions. And so we are really excited because this will be the first time that we've taken Honeymooners now from the presentation room. And the last presentation that we did in 2016, it was there. It was basically fully blocked, fully staged, fully choreographed. It was one of those kinds of presentations.
And this was the fifth or so reading you did?
Yeah, 5th or 6th. I mean, I'm serious. We've done a lot of them.
One thing I try to stress to listeners is that beautiful polished musical you see in the theater has gone through many iterations, and almost never is it the case where, like a Mozart symphony, the show is born fully formed. There's often a long, tortuous path of revision and changing the plot. So everyone goes through this process, and this is just part of the business.
In the 40s, 50s, and 60s, here's the difference. In the 40s, 50s, and 60s, let's take a classic show like Oklahoma. Oklahoma tried out in New Haven. And basically what they did is they did their workshop in New Haven. And you would stay there and you would just work and work and work and have extended previews, and then you'd come in to Broadway. And then what happened was this guy named Michael Bennett in the 70s, when he was working on this little-known show called A Chorus Line, what he did is he invented the workshop process. And it's only since the mid-70s that the workshop has become kind of the de rigueur way in which you develop a show. Because for producers, even if you end up spending a couple $100,000 in your workshop, which is still money, but it's a heck of a lot less than spending a couple million to go out of town. And that's not to say that some shows still go out of town. A lot of shows go out of town, but less do now. And I think you're going to see a growing trend where producers are going to say, hey, I'd rather do a string of workshops, right, that get it right
and
over
expose
time.
your reputation to the press.
Then do it. Now, for a show like Frozen is now trying out in Denver, and it's Disney. So, I would think that Disney has the resources and means to do that tryout. A number of shows have tried. Kinky Boots, Jerry Mitchell's wonderful, fabulous show, that tried out in Chicago. So it's not. I'm not saying that one is better than the other. I'm just saying that I think from a financial standpoint, the workshop process is starting to be looked at as this is a good way for us to develop our show versus opening cold in New York. And shows that open cold in New York, I think the last show I can remember, like the Famous show, and there's a wonderful video Netflix thing that Lonnie Price did on Merrily We Roll Along. Have you seen that?
I haven't.
Oh, look it up. And it really talks about what the cast went through and Hal Prince and Stephen Sondheim, and because they opened Merrily, which is one of my favorite shows, but they opened cold.
And that's a gutsy show to open cold in New York.
And it lasted 16 performances and closed. And now, it's had many, many triumphant reincarnations. It's hard to open a show cold. So the nice thing about Honeymooners, for our show, had they said, you're going to open at Old Globe or La Jolla or the Goodman or Denver Center, I would have been equally as thrilled. The nice thing about Paper Mill, it's 15 minutes from the city. So the kinds of folks that are going to be listening to our show are the kinds of people that are going to get our show. They get it. They're transplanted New Yorkers.
You're not that
pretty
far
much.
from Brooklyn.
Yeah. And so for us, it's a nice demographic to have. So we're absolutely thrilled and can't wait to show it off and see what people think. And God willing, we can get to the next step.
So rehearsals for the show are beginning
a week from today. Yeah.
So your blood pressure and pulse is probably on the upkeep. What is your approach as a writer and a composer during rehearsals? Do you sit back and let the magic happen, or are you on call for rewrites? What's your involvement?
So it's interesting, and it's a good question, and it's changed. I would say that when I started with my very first show, I was micromanaging. I was hovering. I was a pain in the neck. I have a very specific style in the way in which I write. I write with like 15 fingers because I've always written as if I'm filling out the whole orchestra.
So it's 15 fingers, you're saying. Yeah.
Very thick and very specific, and I would be very maniacal about it. Like, you must play it this way. Now, first of all, I still play with 15 fingers, but I also understand and that whoever's going to take my music, my copyist will write it down, right? And then our orchestrator is going to take it and do whatever he needs to do to make it sound great, right? What I do now is I basically let it go, because I understand when you let it go, better things can happen. And so my approach in rehearsal is, I've done my work, tell me what I need to do. If it needs changing, we'll talk about it. Sometimes I'll agree, sometimes we'll have a discussion, but more often than not, I'm more than willing to make changes. I'm open to that. It's kind of exciting, and things change as the show evolves, as it develops its own organic sensibility. Sometimes songs that work really, really well initially, you need to be rethought. Or the other thing that I've learned is most writers, we tend to write too many verses, right? That I've learned that you got to write very succinctly, and you got to cut. You got to be willing to cut a lot. And so I am all about letting go and listening to the director. And I trust my director. I trust John. If John comes to me or Josh, okay, and they say, not sure about this, or what about that? I listen. I really listen, and so they can inspire me.
Let's pause here and take a listen to one of the songs from the Honeymooners. This one's called The Madison Avenue Line.
For 15 years he's worked on Madison Avenue, and he'll still be on this street, but he'll work a different beat. From this day on, our own Ralph Cramden'll have a new occupation. He'll leave a humble station behind, and we're glad that it can happen to one of our kind. He's a workaday Joe, he's a neighbor we know, he's a local who's going express. High society next stop, destination success. Ain't we proud to see a fella like us go from driving a bus to achieving such luster and shine? They've called him up to the big leagues on the Madison Avenue line. No more merely a token taker. Now I'm a money maker. My life's one long green light. No more. Sir, can you change $1? I'm gonna change my collar from blue to white. Come tomorrow, he'll be with the elite on the side of the street where they don't even eat, no, they dine. I'm signing up for the sweet life on the Madison Avenue line.
He'll schedule meetings and make $1 million deals.
He'll have a gal to help remind him. He'll have a seat that he can roll around on wheels without a whole darn bus behind him. When you're all out of pep and you're out as a schlep, life is telling you step to the rear. Stop and think about Cramden, and skies above you will clear. He's the living proof a driver should not be resigned to his lot till he's parked in a spot on Cloud 9. Ralphie boy has made history on the Madison Avenue line. What shall we call a day that's oh so momentous? A true busman's holiday, a blessing heaven sent us, for he is a hero to our unsung minority. They ought to put a statue of him in front of the Port Authority. He'll be a model of class for the people who passed, and below him a brass lettered sign saying, here's a fella who's inspiration to those in any career. Here's a story that has a moral that should be
perfectly clear. If a fella like Ralph can make it, then so can any man here on the Madison Avenue line.
Can you talk a little bit about the musical stylistic approach that you selected, and in particular how you took your own style and adapted it to a period piece? Did you try to write musically of that period? Did you do something that was more modern?
Yes, good question. So I was hired because they liked the fact that I can embrace that 1950s, early 60s feel, that brassy, ballsy, golden era sound of Broadway. And so I knew that I wanted to stay in that area. I knew that, for Ralph to sing a rock tune probably wouldn't have been as compelling. And so, number one, I was hired to deliver a certain sound, and number two, I liked that sound, and number three, you still have a lot of latitude within that sound, to go in the style of Frank Lesser and Julie Stein and what I call the muscular writers, Bob Merrill, I was influenced by that. And at first I was a little nervous, I must confess, like sitting down and literally writing something for Ralph Cramden or Ed Norton. It was like, whoa, like this look crazy. But
these are characters people know very well.
Yeah, these are people like that fourth wall was kind of talking to me a little bit, and then I just silenced it and I said, go for it. And the very first thing that we wrote, Pete and I, was a song for the bus drivers called the Madison Avenue Line. And this is when Ralph hears that he's gotten the job as a jingle writer, and they're basically celebrating with him. And it's a big, muscular, guy's number. And believe it or not, that stayed with us. And that still is, that very first number, it's like the fourth or fifth song on our show. And it stayed with us. I think the best way to describe it is it's classic Broadway. There's comedy songs. There's charm songs. There's production numbers. And the one thing that we only have one ballad. Now, in the days of Lehman Engel, Lehman always said a show can only afford two ballads. And we had our two ballads. And we had one ballad somewhere in the middle of the first act that was stopping the action. And I was so proud of it because it was this really cool, almost Harold Arlen-esque jazzy feel with these great chords. And I was so excited. And, it was sung beautifully.
A sense where this story is going.
Yeah. And we've just had this hilarious scene. And then we sat there in the last presentation going, oh, God, oh, well, see you later. Going, gone. And that's what happens. That's what happens. You realize it, right? And so we have one ballad, but I'm proud of that ballad. And it's actually a love song between the two men. Not a literal love song, but a love song about their friendship that's gone awry in the second act. And they've gone their separate ways. So it's a very unique kind of love song, right?
An ode to friendship.
Yeah, and it's called "I'll Miss the Guy," and I'm very, very proud of it. But it's a quick, short song. But the paper mill will be very telling because when we put it up on its feet, I'm sure there'll be more changes, and we'll see. But I guess the general style is kind of brassy, classic, kind of golden era. Think Gypsy. Think Take Me Along, if we have any musical theater aficionados out there. Think Funny Girl. Think that era, that kind of feel, and you're kind of in the land where I think we should be. We have a small band of 10 right now, but we'll we'll expand it.
You can get quite a sound out of 10 players.
We can. And Doug Besterman is our orchestrator, and I'm just thrilled to death because he orchestrated the producers, and the Honeymooners kind of fills the space that the producers filled in terms of that traditional Broadway sound. That's the Broadway that we're trying to live in terms of our score and in terms of the whole piece. And so it's pretty heartening to know that there's still an appetite for it on Broadway. And there's an appetite for, I've always said this, Broadway is a big tent, and there should be a lot of different styles and a lot of different musical sounds that come out of that tent. And it shouldn't just be one sound. And so we're hoping that, we fill that niche for people that are looking for a particular feel and sound of Broadway, and that's where we are with the show.
And how nice to do that in conjunction with a set of characters that are beloved and well known and iconic in TV.
Yeah.
So you have that working in your favor.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because for a couple of our readings, we had the show starting at the bus depot. And we were, firmly convinced that, we're going to start it there. And, we had a whole different thing going on. At one point, we were going to start it just in the middle of the city at Christmas time. And that went by the wayside. And finally, I forget who it was. It could have been John Rando. Yeah. And John said, this show has to start in the apartment. When you look at every Honeymooners
it's always
episode,
set in the apartment.
It's always set in the apartment. When that curtain goes up, you got to see that classic table and the checkerboard. And sure enough, when we did it last time, and we started it in the apartment, it was like gangbusters. It's like, yes, because the trick is that you gotta make a nod to some of the classic things, but make it fresh too. And it's interesting because there was just a big article in the New York Times about that regarding Frozen, and how it can't be the movie, but it has to have that familiarity. Little Mermaid has the same thing. Beauty and the Beast had the same thing. You had to reinvent it for the stage and not just hearken to the original source material, black and white, verbatim.
But another issue that comes when adapting a sitcom, unlike what Disney's doing, you're really transforming something across genres and modalities.
Yes.
A sitcom can be very plot-driven, and it can have a lot of abuse.
Right.
Have its own. I don't mean abuse in a literal sense, but there's a lot of barbs being exchanged in a show like this. And a musical has to have character motions front and center. So your job is considerably harder than simply taking a film musical and saying, well, how do we put this on stage?
No, totally. And you have to root for something. In a musical, as Maury Yeston taught us at BMI, you got around 20 minutes of goodwill at the top. That's usually kind of the golden rule. You got 20 minutes to get an audience seated, to get them comfortable, so that they say, okay, I know what this is about. Who am I rooting for? Oh, okay, I'm rooting for Ralph Cramden. Okay, I'm rooting for Ralph and Ed. Okay, I got that. And why should I care? Right? What are the stakes? What's involved? And so you got around 20 minutes to get that all done. If you don't do that, according to Maury, and I believe him, you don't have a show. And the good news is, by the end of our show, people are actually crying. I mean, we've gotten people to be invested in our story and our characters, and that's the difference between the sitcom and a musical, because you got 2 hours to kind of go through that arc and get people invested in the story and the stakes and what's at risk for these people. And as silly as it is, Ralph Cramden and Ed Norton, you still got to get an audience involved and invested, right? And that's the beauty. Will Curly win the girl? Will she go to the box social with him? Will Eliza Doolittle, become a lady?
If you watch any sitcom for a long enough period of time, there will invariably be an episode, maybe Simpsons or Honeymooners. There'll be some episode, maybe 1 in 10, where they'll have a moment of deeper authenticity, and the real audience, or perhaps the studio audience, will go, ah, and there'll be kind of this sad moment of bonding. A musical has to do that all the time.
Right.
Every moment has to be like that one episode of the show that became strangely sentimental.
That's right.
Without sacrificing the humor.
That's
so
right.
The workload is tremendous.
That's right. And so as the story builds, right, the emotions go deeper. As the build, right, it's almost like something's happening in a linear fashion. The story is building, and you're building the plot. But what's happening underneath is that the audience is getting more and more invested, and the payoffs get bigger and bigger. And that's hard to do. That's hard to, it's a balancing act between story and song.
Particularly with broad comic archetypes.
Right. And when you think about it, you have around 50 minutes, 50, of dialogue, right? And then you have around 45, 50 minutes of song, maybe, in a traditional book musical. And then you have dance. So it's an incredibly compressed thing where you have to get all of this done, right? And then get people to walk out and say, oh man, I am so glad that Emile DeBeck and Nellie Forbish held hands under the table at that last scene as the music was swelling, and that's why I'm crying. Or when Anna is crying, as the King of Siam is dying. Think about the miracle that they created to make that happen. And that's the wonderful challenge of musical theater. I'll end by saying this. When I was a kid, for whatever reason, I had a terrible learning disability. I had an auditory processing problem. So I was really terrible at math, which when you think about it, writing music, here I am composing music and writing musicals, but yet, which is all right brain, and I couldn't do math to save my life. I could not do math to save my life. And I realized later on in life that I always was good in math. I just didn't know it. Because writing a musical, it's solving problems. That's really what I was just solving problems musically, but that's what writing a musical is. By the way, this isn't me, this is Oscar Hammerstein. Each song is a problem to be solved. It's a situation, it's a dilemma that you have to resolve. There's a conflict that has to be resolved in that moment, and you're going to resolve it through that heightened emotion called song, which is what Frank Lesser said, right? You sing when you can no longer speak. And I realized that, oh my God, all these years I've put myself down as being lousy in math, no, I think any composer, any lyricist is a great problem solver, because that's what it is. And that's also helped me when I get into rehearsal, because as opposed to personalizing and saying, oh, you can't take my song away, it's no. Whatever we did to solve the problem earlier, we have a new problem. So we got to solve it differently. And I think when you do that, you get a little distance and you don't personalize it as much. And what I would tell you is, if you look at it that way, then you realize that a show, when it's really working, is just this jigsaw puzzle of problems that you've solved well.
And the audience will never see all the effort and revisionism that went in to that point.
And the best example of that, it's a classic, we all know it, who study musical theater. And I would tell you, anyone that's listening, study musical theater, get the books out, read about, these fascinating reads, like how Oklahoma was created, how My Fair Lady was created. Anyway.
You were going to give a good example, you said.
Yes, I'm going to give a really good example. So this show about Tevye and the milkman and his 5 daughters was out of town in Detroit, and it was not doing well. And they could not get their finger on what was missing, right? Imagine, Fiddler on the Roof, right? They almost closed it. And Jerome Robbins, who was known to be quite something in his time, had all the writers around one night, and I think I don't know who said what, but I know in exasperation somebody screamed, "What is this show about?" And someone just threw up their hands and said, "Tradition." And Jerome Robbins turned around and said, write that. And then the rest is history, because they had solved the ultimate problem. You have to know what your show is about. For Fiddler, it was about tradition. And if you look at the construction of Fiddler on the Roof, every scene is tied back to that theme. That's why it's such a tight show and why it's such a brilliant show. I think Maury used to say that it was maybe the best constructed show ever.
I think it's generally regarded as,
as
the equivalent of Oklahoma for a later period in
right.
musical theater.
That, Gypsy, and King and I. Maury also had a soft spot for King and I. I think those are the three musicals to study. But the point is, what is the Honeymooners about? It's about going to the moon for the person that you love, and that you'll do anything to go to for that person, right? And you'll never give up trying. We're clear on that. And a lot of the shows that seem to be a little shaky are not necessarily as clear on that. And I think that's the danger of a lot of modern day adaptations. A lot of people are taking adaptations of shows and saying, oh, let's do this. It's a great catchy title, right? Well, it's not just the title. It's not just the title that are going to bring people into the audience.
The theme. Yeah.
Into the theater. It's, how did you hook me? How did you reinvent this so that I care about what I'm seeing? And that's the key.
One of the privileges of being an interviewer and hearing somebody's life story compressed into an hour is that you get to look for patterns and make highfalutin observations. And one thing I've noticed, well, there are two things I thought I'd comment upon. One is that the style of music you're working on in Honeymooners, now at the stage of your career, recalls the music you grew up listening to in your formative years that we discussed at the beginning of this interview. So it's interesting how you've come full circle to your musical origins in a way.
Yeah, actually, I never thought of that. Actually, I swear to God, this is a great insight. Thank you for that. But it's really true. It's really true. It is like comfort food for me. I mean, when I think about the songs that influence me as a writer, I mean, it harkens to those eras. So Honeymooners was deeply gratifying because it allowed me to get back into that mode. So I think you just became my therapist.
Well, to put it in much more succinct form, the adage is write what you know, and then applies to music as well as it does to stories.
Right. When I wrote my very first commercial musical, I had to dip into a completely different genre that I had no knowledge about, that country music. And well, I think I kind of fudged my way through it. It was a very good lesson for me, which is write what you know, to your point. I'm ready to do something different, and I'm looking at some new projects with some people that will take me to a different place, which I'm looking forward to. And I think I'm ready to go back and try something a little bit more contemporary. But your point is well taken. I have come full circle.
I'm going to recall your earlier observation about the life of a theater writer, how there are ups and downs and there are disappointments, and then you have highs and lows. And at the time, hours ago, when we were talking about that, you made it sound like it's a sine wave. You go up, you go down, you go up and down, and there's an equilibrium in the middle. And what I would suggest about your career is that though clearly you've had ups and downs, the overall trend is an ascent, because you started out writing small reviews and more modest shows, or writing shows that your BMI professor said don't even bother. And you've been working through increasingly recognizable properties, and now you are writing an adaptation of an iconic TV show that's very much part of American culture. So while there is that up and down, I think it's a little bit like the stock market. The overall trend is rising.
Thank you.
So,
that's very kind. At the end of the day, a lot of it is just tenacity, a belief in your project, truly falling in love, making sure you're working with the right people that have the same work ethic that you do, and the same dreams and the same sense of loyalty to the project and to you. And I think that's one of the reasons why I stopped being a composer-lyricist, is I'm a naturally collaborative person. And if that's who you are, then come out of yourself, right? And seek the comfort of that collaboration, because that can be very exciting when it really works, and it can be very aggravating when it doesn't. But that's the risk that you take. But what I would say is you got to persevere. This is not a career for the short-term minded. There are two words here: show, business. And the business of show can often be incredibly exasperating and frustrating. And what we're really good at is the show, is the writing, and that's exhilarating. And that's the part that you should just enjoy. And I've learned that there are going to be a lot of times in your career where you're going to want to give up, and it's going to be a really bad day. And I've been there, and I've touched that way too many times in my career. And anyone who tells you that they haven't is lying. But you got to persevere. And it's very gracious of you to say. And I guess you're right. There's been this ascent, but put it this way: the slope has been very gradual. I wish it was a little bit of a steeper hill, but that's why we do this.
If our listeners are interested in finding more about the Honeymooners and you as an artist, where can they go online?
So my daughter, Marla Mindell, that's her stage name, and she is a fabulously talented Broadway actress in her own right. She's also a fabulous graphic designer and website builder. So if anyone needs a website, she's the one to go to. So she recently redid my website, and anyone that's interested can go to Stephen, Stephen, A. Weiner, Weiner.com, StephenAWeiner.com, and you will see Marla's brilliant work. And that has a lot of my songs on there, all of my shows. It's a pretty in-depth website, and that's the best place to go. And also has my agent's information if you want to get access there. And finally, if you're interested in purchasing any of my material, my songs, I have a number of songs that you can buy through PayPal that's kind of hooked up there through the media.
For our listeners, I'll also mention that Marla Mindell was the subject of an interview on Musical Talk earlier this year, so you're encouraged to go and listen to that episode.
Yep.
And Marla, if you're listening, no matter how many Broadway credits you have, you'll always be Daddy's web designer.
That's right. There you go.
Stephen, it's been a real pleasure listening about your history and the process. I'm looking forward to hopefully seeing the show in some incarnation. We all wish you broken legs and good fortune, and can't wait to see what happens with the show. Thanks again.
I'm very, very pleased to be here. Thank you so much. I appreciate the time.
We'll wrap up with one last song from the Honeymooners. This tune is called Baby, You're the Greatest.
A honeymoon can end so soon. You blink, the spark is gone. But we're not done. We're in for one long haul. 'Cause in our heads we're newlyweds. Our love goes on and on. And baby, you're the greatest, the absolute first greatest. Baby, you're the greatest of them all. We're honeymooners, still honeymooners, forever honeymooners.
Baby.
Ralph!
What?
It's my turn. Baby, you're the greatest.
This episode of Musical Talk, edited and presented by Mike Shapiro. Copyright Musical Talk 2017, except for the songs where the copyright remains with the original creators. And our thanks go out to them for letting us play their marvellous songs in this programme. To find out more about the world of musical talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk or subscribe to us on iTunes and follow us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can, at Musical Talk Thos.